So welcome. In this third assignment, your major project, 50% of your course assessment, you are asked to look at two major areas. Firstly, we want to look at Indigenous knowledge, particularly from an Australian Indigenous group. So if you have people from an Australian Indigenous group in your classes, then you have a responsibility towards them, and that's a high level of concern by the Australian government. So you need to be able to show in passing this subject that you have a good knowledge of the ways Indigenous people know and Indigenous people think and how they relate to critical thinking. And also you need to have a knowledge of other groups, such as we've got migrants from Africa, we've got Pacific Islanders, we've got Maori from New Zealand, we've got Asians. And so it's important that you know about other groups. And so I think a good sentence or two might say, I may be teaching in such and such an area, such and such a school. If I look at the statistics on the number of people from different Indigenous groups, there are likely to be a large number from this group, and I've chosen that group for that reason. And I think this can be great preparation for your teaching in times to come. Secondly, we want you to relate your personal worldview and philosophy of education to these diverse students' worldviews so that you can teach people from different worldviews effectively without diluting your own worldview. And you could include male, female, gender. If you saw that as interesting and you had space, then you could have differences there. You could include socio-cultural difference as well, and then there are other differences as well. But mainly we're looking at the major cultural differences because that's where the most outstanding differences are going to be. So it'll be good to have some knowledge on these differences. And you'll see more discussion of this in the other video that's been prepared as well by Steve Coddington. If you look at assessment 3, please note that you're not able to submit the final assessment until you've completed the end of semester feedback survey. So you need to do the feedback survey as well. And I welcome as well your thoughts. So if you have concerns or if you're very positive about aspects or both, then I welcome if you want to send a email or get in touch, then very welcome for thank yous and very welcome for suggestions as well as the official one that needs to be done. In terms of looking for Indigenous groups, which is the main focus of this assignment, you could go to Wikipedia, but you should not quote Wikipedia because they don't have the author and they don't necessarily have a large list of references, but often that can be a very fast way to get information. And when you're teaching, it's important to explain that to the students. This has strengths and benefits as a source of information, but it also has those weaknesses. We can't locate the author. We don't know which country, background, culture they're from, and we don't know if it's been changed in the last half hour and it's entirely wrong. So you should try and find other groups as well and other ways of knowing. So there's lots of Indigenous groups in Australia. You need to choose one of these specific groups and you need to research that group. And I've shown you as an example, the Ridgeridgru people. If you go to Google Scholar and put in search on this group of people, and then you look at education, teaching, schooling, pedagogy, you'll find quite a lot of references there. And so on the right-hand side, we've got some information. You need to move very quickly through this so that you don't get bogged down. You need to be able to find references that are going to be useful to you. There are other ways that you can try and find resources as well. So if you put this in here and put thesis abstract, you may find someone has written a thesis on this. And also you could put other triggers that might set off ways of finding scholarly resources that would be very helpful for you there. So there are lots of other groups around the world that you could choose, but I think you need to think about those groups that are going to be likely to be in the groups that you teach. Certainly there's an emphasis in Indigenous groups on oral transmission, and up to 1500 AD, the emphasis in Western white society, European society, was also on oral transmission, except amongst the clergy and the academics and the lawyers and the accountants. And so we've seen since Martin Luther and the Protestant Reformation an increased emphasis on written knowledge, and that's helped advance science and society in Western society and modernity. Fascinating story. Anyone would tell me who invented the printing press in Germany back around 1500? Any hands going up? So it was Gutenberg, and in some ways it's a wine press that he uses. So printing press, Gutenberg, and he has this idea that you can press down, and rather than write everything by hand, just like a wine press presses down, you could press down there, and he adjusts it so that it can quickly move one piece of paper to another piece of paper, and it brings about a revelation and a revolution. Unfortunately, he ran out of money and they foreclosed, and they took his printing press away, and for a few decades they didn't recognize he was the inventor of it. But the first books printed in Germany were often Bibles, and I had a chance once to visit over there and to print a copy of the first page of the Gospel of John on a Gutenberg press. There's a photo somewhere of me doing that, but certainly it brought a change from oral transmission to written transmission. And you could think about that. There's major changes. Written transmission, we move from left to right logically. We communicate through language. Oral language often has 2,000 or 3,000 words, but written language often has 15 to 20,000 words or more. So we can do more with written language than we do with oral language. Number two, there's the religious worldview, and we encourage you to have a reasonably sized section in your assignment on religious worldviews, both the native worldview and your own religious worldview. And we encourage you to think about how you will handle differences in religious worldview. So if you've got Christians and Christians from different backgrounds, how you will handle those. And some Christian schools can be more charismatic, Pentecostal, experience-based and conversion-based. Others can be more tradition-based. And so you've got to be ready for those differences. But then there's other religious worldviews as well. And I think one of the real challenges for us as Christian teachers is that people may go to a Christian school or another type of school and have parents who are Christian, but if they're not so Christian, how do we work with them? And there are ways of describing them as not yet Christian. And so there are ways in which you can work with that. Any thoughts, Stephanie, if you had someone who wasn't a Christian, came from a Christian background, parenting, and in your Christian school, but they were a bit frustrated with the whole Christian journey, how would you handle them in your class? Any thoughts, Stephanie?
Yeah, I think that's pretty common to see in the Christian school, actually. I think it's a matter of not being like forceful with it, like not trying to force, Jesus down their throats, because I think that's when people get quite standoffish, is if, they've grown up with it, but they haven't really had their own revelation, and they kind of, they don't like being told what they should believe. So I guess it's kind of just like a gentle kind of including the gospel and including Jesus in everything that you do, so that it just kind of becomes like an underlying message to everything that you do. And just, asking them if they have questions, asking them what their concerns are, what they're struggling with in that kind of faith journey. And yeah, I guess just, yeah.
And that's going to raise ethical questions too, isn't it, as to how we relate to them and value them. And so I think there's some important ethical questions there. That's very well said, Stephanie. So keep in mind, there could be the secular worldview, and you might want to comment on that a bit as well. As well as that, there are different ways of explaining the natural world. And so you've got the modern way of explaining the natural world. And I think from a Christian perspective, we see problems with a modernist view of the natural world, but also Christianity contributes to the modernist view as well. Matilda, your thoughts and questions?
Yes. I'm just wondering how we're going to fit all this in. It seems to be a little bit, I'm struggling to see connections to it all. I know it's all for like trying to analyze the future students that we're going to have. And I don't really, would you just try and just discuss the different points and how they all link with each other, and how we would incorporate them into our actual writing, and like how a body structure of a essay would look like for us if we were discussing this, and which stuff we have to incorporate or which stuff is an option.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think you very much need to choose. Initially, I think the starting point is to briefly acknowledge your own worldview, and you're asked to consider your philosophy of education. So in a little diary entry, I'd reflect, as you did an assignment too, on your philosophy of education and your pedagogical approach. So I think that would be one thing that I would be thinking about a little bit is what is your philosophy of education and your pedagogical approach. So it's my views. And then number two, certainly go with the Australian Aboriginal group. So choose one of those, and I would be doing the research on that, trying to find out as much as I can about that group, but particularly in relation to the ways in which we're going to teach that group. So we're interested in teaching, we're interested in worldview, but not just worldview, how we teach those students. And so we're interested in how do they see the world? How do they see religion? How do they see the way they communicate? We've got quite an issue here in that if most of the assessment that we're doing is going to be written, then if they're an oral culture, they're going to find that difficult if it's not valued in their classroom. Sesame Street sought to encourage written engagement amongst people in America and then around the world. And we face this here. Do you find that there are Christians who are in families from age 2, 3, 5, 6 through to teenagers who don't see the value in writing and essays, who are wanting to go out and get trades, and they're wanting to be very active in our Christian churches, and they want to be pastors, but they're not actually so focused on writing an essay, and they struggle if they go on and want to do studies in a certain area. They really struggle with that. So I think the oral transmission issue is quite an issue for us as educators, and we wrestle with that. It's not the only way to know and communicate, but because you got 20,000 words rather than 2,000 or 3,000 words, it's hugely valuable. And every job you benefit if you can do that. So there's a whole issue in that. So I think on the way through, you could mention that issue, that is oral versus writing. And then you've got the benefits in being able to write, and then you've got the resistance amongst not only First Nation people, but amongst lower socioeconomic people, if I can use that term, all through our society. So you've got an issue that's rising there, and I think that's a valuable one to work with. You've got an issue in terms of mathematics. A lot of people aren't so keen on mathematics, and they're the two big ones, English and maths, I think, in some ways. Some aren't so keen on history. But then again, I love history, but not everyone's going to see that as highly important. And then you've got to choose another group. And so look at another group as well. So that gives you 3 groups. And then I think you've got to choose what's going to be the theme that's going to hold it all together. I think one theme is education, pedagogy, philosophy of education. I think another theme is thinking and critical thinking, if you want to go with that as a theme that carries through. So I think you want one theme, one argument that holds your essay together in a mind map, and then you want to break out to 3 ways of thinking, and one of them being my views as a teacher. Again, not too much subjective first person, but very much acknowledging your view as a teacher. And you've got one issue is Christian and non-Christian and other religion, I think, is a theme that's standing out. It's an issue that you could well do to develop as another of the issues that you look at. And then we have looked in assignment 2 a bit at modernity versus other ways of understanding the world. We'll be looking at that a bit as well as we go through this assignment here. So I'd say if we've got, before we start the theme, then you've got your views as a teacher, and then we've got the Australian group, and then number 3, another group, and then it's going to all revolve around the major issues that we're developing. But yeah, we've got to decide how we put these ideas together, including these worldviews. But in the essay question, we see it here quite clearly. You've got the 2 Indigenous groups, and we've also got your understanding as a teacher. And then you've got these other things that you're not going to have time to look at all. So certainly your philosophy of education will be quite important here to think about your approach to teaching, and then how that relates across. And there's lots of other things you could look at, such as assessment, reporting, but certainly you don't have the space to do many of these. And so only go there if you see this as helpful. Scholarly resources. Does that help a bit, Matilda and Gabriella and others? Everyone there?
Yep. Can I just clarify?
Yeah.
So it's in the beginning, we'll talk about our worldview, like the other assignment that we had just done. And then in the second paragraph, we'll talk about the Australian Aboriginal group that we have selected. And then in the third paragraph, we'll talk about the second group that we have selected. And then in a fourth paragraph or a conclusion, whatever we want, we'll kind of bring all that together by discussing how we'd kind of address those, and that we'd come across those in a classroom, and how we would, you know, not dilute our own worldview by supporting these students and bring in real ethical ideas and questions.
Yes, I would agree with that, except I wouldn't call them paragraphs, I'd call them sections in the essay. Okay. So in the introduction, I would say this essay will discuss the challenge of education in a multicultural society, and it will recognise that my background leads me to have most knowledge about one particular culture, one particular viewpoint. And the challenge of education is to educate students from different backgrounds. And this essay will look at, and then you describe what you'll look at. And then you might go on in the next paragraph or two or three to say, as a teacher, and I think I would probably bring in my philosophy there. You can have, instead of being point number 1, this could be point number 4. But if you bring it in here, I'm from a Christian background. I'm from a particular urban city dwelling. I'm a particular gender. And so you could say something about I'm raised in a Christian home. So that's very beneficial when I'm working with people of the same background, but it's a challenge working with people from different backgrounds. And then about paragraph 4, 5, or 6, I would then go on to one, and then you have to give a reason why you switch from what you've been discussing. So it's the reason to switch to the next discussion point. And I would say something like, one of the major challenges we face in Australia is honouring the First Nation people. And this essay will now look at a particular First Nation people group, and they could be people in my classroom that I am teaching, and I'm going to examine them in some depth. And then you go on and talk about this group. Scholar such and such in a study at university such and such says this group face a challenge in education because they have an oral background. And this could in fact be another intro. So this could be an intro paragraph to 5 challenges with First Nation people groups. So there could be 5 challenges that you could introduce there. And then the next paragraph, you could in fact go on to this issue, oral. And you could say, and then you could go on to another issue, literacy. And then you could go on to another issue, which could be religious. That is, they have a particular religious view. So this could be a few paragraphs there. And then you go on to another group. And again, you want the reason that you switch to this other group now. So you say another group that's highly significant are Pacific Island people, Asian people. And then having given the reason to switch to them, you might have an intro to, and this time you don't have room to go. So you might say 5 challenges, but due to space, I'm not going to discuss these here. So due to space, only 1 paragraph on this, or 2 at the most, because you don't have that sort of space. I've moved all the major issues into here. So got rid of that as a separate section. I've moved all the philosophy back here to point number 1. And so really, I think the strength of the essay is possibly the issues there. So I think that's one of the key points that's being raised. Another key point will be the amount of research that you can do in a scholarly fashion on the Australian group that you're working with. And then probably another key point is your philosophy of education and values. But that's drifting away, I think, from the key question: how do you teach people from a different Indigenous group to yourself? And sometimes looking at educational issues such as literacy or religion. And you'll see in the other video that Stephen Collington has prepared, there's quite a bit of discussion on not only philosophy of education, there's a discussion on ways of knowing. And in the ways of knowing, there is that diagram that's been put forward there. Yeah, so you could look at that. And so you'll see in terms of the ways of knowing, you're being asked to look at 3 ways of knowing. Firstly, a religious way of knowing. So the religious way of knowing is one very important one. So you need to talk about at least one different religious way of knowing. You could, I think, push the point and go for the secular, which I was talking to Stephanie about, the non-Christian, because I think that's a challenge for us that we do really face. You could talk about the religious way, which is really what they're after, is an indigenous religious, the rainbow serpent that makes the world. Has anyone got any hand up? Someone who's got something to say about the rainbow serpent in the world and all of that? No great experts there. Hands shooting up.
I just had a question.
Yep.
You said with the Indigenous group that we needed to get scholarly articles.
Yep.
I was keen to look at the group we worked with, but I'm not sure how much there is in regards to that. A lot of my knowledge would be firsthand. Is that possible, or do I need to pick a group that have literature about them?
Yeah, I love the firsthand. I think that's great. How do you spell your religious group, your First Nation group?
Maru, M-A-R-T-U.
R-T-U. Yeah, is that right?
Yeah, that's correct.
And then education, pedagogy. So I think that if you put that into Google Scholar, and then what we're hoping to do is to then find someone who's done some study on that from a scholarly perspective.
Yeah.
And then if you can, that's good. If you can't, then you'll just try Google, and then hopefully you'll find something there. So here's one on, tell me if this is going to be useful. So this is Matu child rearing and its implications for child welfare. So that looks slightly useful, I think. Yeah. So
I think what I found is that a lot of, I guess my personal, the way I look at Indigenous education team often is very different to the way others do it remotely, if that makes sense. My teaching philosophy or whatever.
Absolutely. So I think from personal experience, one of the things I've suggested in the past is write a journal entry, put a date and say, I recall, and then just write it out. And I think journal is so helpful because it gives you a chance to fully express and feel how this went. And you may observe what a parent does. You may observe what an elder does, what a student does. This is so very, very helpful. So I encourage you to keep a journal, keep a diary, and make journal diary entries. Yeah, and you can do interviews if you wish. That's all very, very helpful as well. You can make interviews anonymous. So anonymous has the safeguard that they feel safe. I think as long as you're very careful, you could also record, maybe not for this subject, but then quote from it. I interviewed this person and so on, but don't make the interview part of the subject because you might have ethics to do. And then also, I like your idea of you may have different approaches. So I think it's important to be authentic and true to your approaches. So I certainly encourage you to explore your approaches. The big danger I see is if you pursue your approaches for 10 years with no interaction with any other people or person, they will become strange. And if you go for 10 years and don't talk to any other person about your unique approaches, then, as I say, the strangeness will get more and more strange. And if you only talk to 2 or 3 people who have the same views of you, I think they'll still be strange. I think it's important that you talk to different viewpoints and scholars in order to see the weaknesses in your own worldview are, if in talking to others, your view survives, then I think they'll be very robust, very valuable. And then if they survive even further, then you could become a leading thinker in the area. Any thoughts, Victoria, on those two suggestions, diary keeping and developing your own approaches?
Yeah, no, that's good. I guess I just find that a lot of the research that I've seen so far seems to be more like it doesn't seem to lead to. Solomon, can you be quiet for a minute? It just doesn't seem to lead to like it's not for educational outcomes, if that makes sense. Like it's not trying to improve necessarily the. I guess I see a lot of issues in education for Indigenous kids that I feel are not addressed in the research yet. But yeah, I mean, what you've said is all good. And I guess personally, interviews, I found that they struggle to do interviews because of their collective culture. Just struggling to speak on behalf of the people is not something that they enjoy doing.
Can you tell me 2 or 3 issues not addressed yet? Just the words, 2 or 3 issues not addressed yet.
So how to fix it, like attendance. Attendance seems to be a huge issue.
Yeah.
Because there's a lot of cultural things around that. Another one seems to be parental, like they don't like cultural mixing, like between the cultures. So they're concerned about those things mixing together. And who's teaching what, if that makes sense. That kind of matters to them a lot. But no one's been able to seemingly bridge those concerns in the particular group that I've looked at so far.
So they're 3 great issues that I think you can do really, really well to raise. So the first one, under attendance, I think some other scholars may have looked at that. So if you go to Google Scholar, try and find something on that. But then if you can't find something, then put down, I think, a paragraph as much as you can, develop that attendance, non-attendance with the Aboriginal cultural education schooling. So try and find something.
And so you would suggest that if I can't find it within the group that I'm looking at, to look broader?
Yeah, I think you may have to move outside that group. And so I've just typed into Google Scholar attendance, non-attendance, cultural education schooling. So we've got one article here. We've got another one, school attendance, another one, Aboriginal non-attendance, revising the debate. That looks like a really good article, even though you can't buy the article yourself. In the preview, I think you could quote it and say, Jan Gray, Quentin Beresford say 2002 that non-attendance is a significant problem. And in their article about the situation, they research it and then move on. You could look at whether you've got access to that article. And then I think that's a very, very good point. I'd do a whole paragraph on attendance and non-attendance, and then I would suggest the alternatives. I think, there are interesting alternatives if they don't attend for a fortnight and go out on a family activity. If someone was able to record some of what they did on the phone, then that could be marked as an educational opportunity. I think we don't recognise the other activities, and some are going to homeschooling for that reason. There's a lot of things happening to address that. You also mentioned the cultural mixing. So again, I'd type that into mixing, separation, into your Google Scholar and into your university college library, mixing of cultures, non-mixing of cultures. And then your other issue was who is teaching and bridging. So brilliant. I would explore those because they're going to come up more and more. And I would see this as not only a project for this assignment, as a project for the next 3 years, is to think through what are the steps that can be developed, and journal it more, write it more, and research it, make it a, you know, a 3-year research project. You go on and do a master's in those sorts of areas, and I think it would be so very, very valuable. So I really like your thinking along those lines. Other questions? Hands up. So if you look at the diagram in the video, you'll see that at the center, as a Christian, you may see Christianity and the Bible at the center. You may see a reasoned defense of your belief. This will be different in a Christian school and in a secular setting. Then around this, we have 3 of the major ways of knowing. So metaphysics, what's the big way we know? So that was the first 3 weeks. You either have a natural theology of God or an experiential theology of God, or you are surrender and open to God revealing himself. So it's not based on your thinking, it's based on God's revelation. So that's metaphysics, the big answers. And Plato, he acknowledges the presence of the gods, whereas Aristotle, he looks more at a natural world. What's it tell us? Epistemology, that is, we have a way of knowing. And then today we're talking about ethics. We're talking about value and ethics. And so the native people will have a big picture of existence, which could be Christian, or it could be native, or could be a combination of both. They have a way of knowing that could be different to our way of knowing, and they have a system of values that can be different to ours. We move out further to the ways of knowing. We know through our 5 senses, but we also have inner senses, intuitions and conscience. And these can be given to us by culture, but they could be placed within by God. We have ways of logical reasoning. We have creative imagination and language. And then we have emotions, and we have faith and memory and brain and neurons. And then as we move out, language connects with English, language connects with everything. Senses connects with science, but everything. Intuition connects with Christian faith, but everything. Reasoning connects with logic like maths, but everything. Imagination connects with art and music, but everything. And so you see the ways of knowing can also be fields of knowledge. So language can be a field of knowledge in English. Intuition can be a field of knowledge in the arts. Reasoning can be a field of knowledge in philosophy. And so you're not going to be able to cover all of these, but you are asked to choose religious knowledge, as you need a paragraph on religious knowledge in the assignment, and then you need to choose 2 other areas to look at. And so talking before about the Maori people, you could choose language, written and oral, or you could choose just 2 of these, whichever you're wanting to focus on. Now, this could come also from your research. So rather than start with these and move to Google Scholar and the college online library resources, you could actually go there first with your people group and find out what it is, and reverse engineer it back to these and find 2 of these to work on. So it can work both ways, forwards and backwards. Sometimes you've got to rewrite the intro to your assignment when you realize you found things totally different to what you're setting out to do as well in your assignment there. So I think that's quite helpful in the assignment to look at that diagram and think about it, and then certainly read carefully through what's written here, but recognize you don't have to cover everything. As Matilda said, you are only wanting to look at one major theme, such as education, and you're wanting to look at some aspects of you as a teacher and your philosophy, and then you're wanting to look at a couple of aspects in terms of the 2 Indigenous groups, but one especially, and they could be issues such as language and literacy, or issues such as Christian and non-Christian, there. Any questions? No. All right, so I think we've given a fair bit of coverage to that. So let's take our 10-minute break and we'll come back and look at ethics. So I'll see you all in 10 minutes. If you have further questions at the end of the next 50-minute session, there'll be time there as well. So thank you, each one.